So like I said last week, I want to try each week to look at a different small passage in the Haggadah and really do a deep dive to try to understand that particular passage. And I'm deliberately picking ones which are difficult and strange. So last week we dealt with a difficult passage in terms of how we send a kind of mixed message to the quote-unquote wicked child, and how we navigate that at the Seder. Hi, welcome. And and this week I want to look at a story where the stakes are a little lower, but if you think about the trajectory of the Seder and kind of the momentum of the Seder, this passage is pretty peculiar. And what I've done throughout the packet is given you a few different artistic renditions of the Seder story. And so what we're going to be spending a little time on this week is the story of the sages at the Seder, which we tell as we begin telling the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. And if you think about it, it's a little bit strange, right? We just got through the 4 questions, which we talked a little bit about last week, and the 4 sons, and then we get to Avadim Hayinu Lefaro b'Mitzrayim, and we start telling the story, and like, sounds interesting. We were slaves, and we got out, and we think we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of the story, which we eventually get to. But before we do that, we kind of stop in our tracks and say, oh, the Haggadah says there was once this story about 5 sages who themselves had their Seder where they told the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. And so we're used to this because whether it's 39 years or 59 years or 79 years, we've been that's been part of the Haggadah. We don't normally question what it's doing there, but I'd like to do that today. What on earth is this story of the 5 sages in Bnei Brak doing in our Seder? Why do we tell that story? Why is it so important to stop what we're doing and stop telling the story in order to tell the story about people who told the story? And what we're going to try to do is really do a literary investigation of this particular story and try to figure out that this tale is not just a charming tale of 5 rabbis in Bnei Brak, that there really is an important agenda that is being transmitted with the telling of this story. And that it's something that we have to know about before we really tell the story of the Exodus. It's an introduction to that mitzvah and that objective which we need to do. So that's what we're going to do. If you turn over the page, this is one of the drawings on the bottom. This story of the 5 sages of Bnei Brak has been a theme that's been revisited in art throughout the ages. So if you look at this one, this is from the Frank Lovell Haggadah collection at the Schechter Institute. Who are those figures? There are 5 rabbis there. Who are those figures? This is really interesting. These are the Rambam, the Beit Yosef, Rashi, the Rif, and the Baal HaTurim. 5 sages who lived in completely different eras. And one of the things that this story, we're going to come back to, is that this story kind of is this time-bending, timeless and not bound by the historical time period, and this becomes a huge motif in the art that surrounds the Haggadah. In fact, they're renderings of Yosef and his brothers around the table in Mitzrayim as like a prefiguring, a presaging of the rabbis in Bnei Brak telling the story. So there's something about this story and the 5 rabbis which has captured the imagination over centuries of artists and of all who read the Haggadah, and we're going to approach this story from a more critical lens, trying to unpack and uncover its significance. So let's take a look at the story itself and the context where we find it. That's the first source above the picture of the 5 sages who weren't actually at a Seder together. And hint, it's very historically unlikely that the 5 sages in this story could have been at a Seder together. They were many years apart, and it would be strange if they were together, but we're going to see that I think makes it more powerful. That's why I included on the cover the Dickens quote. I love this quote. In his preface to David Copperfield, Dickens says, "No one can ever believe this narrative in the reading more than I believed it in the writing," which I think means that his imagining of what he wrote really has a certain truth and authenticity to it that's even more powerful than whether or not it actually happened. So people reading this may speculate about what I'm going to tell you that my writing of it had full belief. And so we're going to talk a little bit about historical truth and the significance of seeing if there's some historical veracity to this story, and what I think is more important, which is what the Baal Haggadah, what the author of the Haggadah was trying to transmit with this story. So let's take a look. So the context is right after Avadim Hayinu, as we said before. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. God took us out from there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. And the Holy One, blessed be He, and had the Holy One, blessed be He, not taken out our ancestors, we, our children, and our children's children would still be enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt. We then shift. Therefore, even if we are all wise, all people of understanding, all well-versed in the Torah, we would still be commanded to tell about the exodus from Egypt. And whoever tells about it at length is worthy of praise. Kol amar belesaper, anyone who adds, embellishes, really anyone who embellishes the story. Right? If you think about it, you know that section where we talk about it wasn't 10 makot, it was 50 makot. Right? There were 50 plagues at the sea, and there were 150, there were 200 plagues, there were 200, you know which part I'm talking about? Like, and they're always like, what are these rabbis, what are they doing? So I think part of that is this line about kol amar b'lesaper, the more you embellish, the more you add, the more you know, when you tell a story, it's like, you know, the next time you tell it, it becomes a little bit more impressive, a little bit more outlandish, a little bit more unbelievable. So that I think is part of the idea of the Haggadah and telling the story over. And then we have this story. So can somebody read in the bold, either in Hebrew or in the underlined in English, the story which we're going to be examining closely this afternoon? Can I get a volunteer? Please. Great.
שהיו מסובים בני ברק, והיו מספרים ביציאת מצרים כל אותו הלילה, עד שבו תלמידיהם ואמרו להם, אבותינו, הגיע הזמן קריאת שמע של שחר.
Good. So if we weren't familiar with this story, now we've re-familiarized ourselves with this story. Let's act as if we've never seen this story before. Okay, can we do a little bit of an exercise that's somewhat hard to do? What's what are some of the details of this story which stand out? Okay, here's an important point. I forgot this is the most critical point. Almost everything we find in the Haggadah, including what we talked about last week, the four sons and the Rasha, has parallels in rabbinic literature. Like we talked about last week, there's the Mechilta, there's the Yerushalmi, and the Haggadah comes up with its own twist on the four sons. But it's working off of canonized texts which appear elsewhere in rabbinic tradition. This story, you're now anticipating, appears nowhere else. It's a Haggadah original. It is indigenous to the Haggadah. We don't find it in any of the Midrashim, in any of the Talmudim, in any of the Toseftot, the Braitot, or whatever it is. This is an original, Haggadah original, indigenous to the Haggadah. So if we want to scramble and look for parallels, we're going to see there is a parallel, but it's striking in how it's the complete opposite of this story. We'll get to that in just a few minutes. And to a certain extent, I think that's what makes the details of this story even more important to focus on. Some people get upset when you say, well, I don't know if the story actually happened. What do you mean the story didn't actually happen? It's part of the Haggadah. But if you think about it, if the story is a legend which is being told, then the details actually become more important. Because if it's a historical account, then, okay, so the students come in and tell them about this. I don't know what the significance of that is, but if it happened like that, that's how it's recorded. It's actually more interesting if you think about it, and more compelling to analyze each detail if this is a Haggadah original, if this is constructed in order to teach a particular point. So with that in mind, let's look at some of the details here and just point them out and file away for later as we try to unpack where this story comes from and what its message is all about and why we stop the telling of the story in order to tell this story. What are some of the details here that require some further examination? What's strange? Striking. I'm going to need some help.
They were there all night.
Okay, so what's the detail of telling the story the entire night, and especially that last detail of the students coming in and telling them, wake up, it's time to say Kriyat Shema. Right? It's charming, it's cute, but again, if this is telling a story and making sure that we have this story before we start telling the story of the Haggadah in earnest, why is that detail included? What else? What else would we want to know? If you were doing an investigation, trying to figure out where did this tale come from? How did this tale get imagined the way it did?
Where exactly is B'nai Brak?
Okay, where is B'nai Brak, and why are they there? Good. Whose hometown is B'nai Brak? Which of the 5 rabbis? Correct, Rabbi Akiva. So why is Rabbi Akiva, who's younger than all of the other figures here, with the exception maybe of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, why is Rabbi Akiva the host? And that's clearly the significance of the B'nai Brak piece. But I would say another question: why these 5 rabbis? Right? If we read this as a rabbinic tale constructed to impart a message as we're about to embark ourselves on this most exalted evening of the Seder, why are these 5 sages placed there? Why are they in Rabbi Akiva's backyard? Why are they getting so engrossed that they need the students to come and tell them, hey, guys, rabbis, it's time to get back to our halachic lives. It's time to say Kriyat Shema Shel Shachar. Okay, so those questions are what we're going to explore. Why were these 5 sages the ones specifically placed at the same Seder? Why is Rabbi Akiva the only denizen of B'nai Brak amongst the group, seemingly the host? What were the details of what they discussed all night, and why are they telling the story with such great detail? And what are we to make of the odd conclusion of the legend when the students appear and remind the rabbis that it is time to recite the morning Shema? So let's figure this out. Okay? The first step in figuring this out, I said before this is a Haggadah original. The first step to figuring this out, though, is to compare, and I want you to leave that page open and the source on the top of the next page. Okay? Try to keep them open like this, because we're going to compare and contrast these two stories. Okay. So I said there isn't a parallel to the story of the 5 sages in Bnei Brak. That's technically true, but there is another Seder story in rabbinic literature. But it's a very different story. And as we're going to see, it's sharply contrasted, almost says to us that this story is in the back of the mind of the person who's writing down our story in the Haggadah as a foil for our story in the Haggadah. So let's take a look at this story. This appears in the Tosefta. The Tosefta is Tanaitic writing that's not in the Mishnah. Right? The Tosefta on Pesachim actually predates the Mishnah. Sometimes the Tosefta was written at the same time as the Mishnah. Sometimes it's later than the Mishnah. Scholars have proven that the Tosefta on Pesachim is earlier, and it reflects kind of an earlier version of how Pesach was celebrated at an earlier time after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. So here's the story as it appears there. The Tosefta first tells us a law of Pesach that we're familiar with. Ein maftirin achara Pesach afikoman kagon egozim tmarim uklayot. We do not finish up after the Pesach with afikoman. So we call the afikoman the piece of matzah. In the Tosefta, the afikoman is actually a description of the kinds of foods that you're not allowed to eat after the Korban Pesach. That's another story how that inversion happened. So you're not, and we observe this halacha today. After you have the afikoman, other than the last 2 cups, you're not supposed to eat and drink other snacks. The last taste is supposed to be that last bit of matzah. Okay. Then the Tosefta tells us, Chayav adam la'asok b'ilchot Pesach kol halayla. A person is obligated to be engaged in the study of the laws of Pesach the entire night. Afilu beino levein beno, even if it's only between a person and their child. Afilu beino levein atzmo, even if a person is having Seder by themselves, they have to study the laws of Pesach the whole night. Afilu beino levein talmido, and also if between a person and his students. Okay, and now we get a ma'aseh. Ma'aseh b'Rabban Gamliel u'Zikenim shahayu mesubin b'beit baitos ben zonin belud. There's a story told, a ma'aseh with Rabbi Gamliel and the elders who were reclining, shahayu mesubin, right? It's the same verb, but they were in the house of Baitos ben Zonin in Lod, a wealthy benefactor named Baitos ben Zonin. V'hayu asukin behilchot Pesach kol halayla, and they were occupied with the laws of Pesach the entire night. Ad krot hagever, until the call of the rooster. They heard the rooster. Higbiu milifenehem, they lifted up the table. The noadu, and they got up. V'halchu lahen lebeit hamidrash, and they went off to the study hall. And then it continues with another detail of the laws of Pesach. Okay. What are the differences between our story and this story? Okay. The wake-up call, right? In our story, in the Haggadah, the students come in and say, hey, Higiya Zman Kriyat Shema Shel Shacharit. In the story, in the Tosefta, the rooster calls. They come to their senses on their own. They're not so engrossed that they lose track of time and place and everything else. And in an orderly fashion, they lift it, they clean up the dishes, and they go over to the Beit Midrash and start studying there. What else?
They're not telling the story of Pesach. They're talking
Good.
about the laws of
Excellent.
Pesach.
Right? That's, I think, the key distinction here. Right? In the story of Rabbi Gamliel in Lod, those are other differences, right? Who is at the Seder and where is the Seder? Right? Our Seder is at Bnei, when I say our, I mean the Haggadah. Our Seder is in Bnei Brak, and we have these 5 sages. Who's absent from that list of 5 sages? Rabbi Gamliel. Why? Rabbi Gamliel is at another Seder. He's at the Seder in Lod, and his Seder is all about Hilchot Pesach. All about studying the laws of the Paschal sacrifice. This is not like the laws of Chametz and Matzah. This is the laws of the Pesach offering, the Paschal lamb. Whereas in our story, the rabbis are discussing the primary focus of the night is the telling of the story in the Exodus. So the attendees are different. Rabbi Gamliel and the anonymous elders in the Tosefta versus the 5 named Tanaim, with Rabbi Gamliel conspicuously absent in the Haggadah. The location, Lod in the Tosefta versus Bnei Brak in the Haggadah. The primary focus of the night, the laws of the Pesach offering, studied all night in the Tosefta versus the telling of the story of the Exodus in the Haggadah. And lastly, the wake-up call, the rooster crowing in the Tosefta, leading to an orderly shift from the Seder to the house of study by the elders, as opposed to in the Haggadah where the students kind of urge the sages to stop discussing the story of the Exodus in order to shift to the daily recital of Shema. So what's going on? What's this all about? So there's lots of theories about this. I included a couple of theories on the bottom of the page. I gave you a little bit of a timeline of different figures to point out how difficult it would have been for Rabbi Akiva to host this Seder when he was a generation younger than most of the other rabbis, than all the other rabbis. So it would be a little strange. There are a number of different theories which have been proposed about why these 2 Seder stories appear and why we have differences. And remember, there's a famous story in the Gemara in Brachot about the time that Rabbi Gamliel was deposed, right? You know that story? Rabbi Gamliel was of the opinion that Mariv is a chovah, and Rabbi Yeshua said Mariv is a reshut, and they got into a big fight, and this was the 3rd time they got into a fight, and Rabbi Gamliel made Rabbi Yeshua bow down before him and acknowledge and humiliate himself, and the other rabbis said enough is enough, and they deposed Rabbi Gamliel, but they couldn't pick Rabbi Yeshua because that was, too political, and they didn't want to pick other people because Rabbi Akiva, because he didn't have the social standing, so they end up picking Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and that's where the whole Harei Kiven Shivim Shana comes into play. He grazed overnight. He was only 18 years old, and he didn't look the part. So, does any of this ring a bell? So some suggest that the reason why they're not at the same Seder is because this was the year of the beef between eventually they made up, and Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah alternated as the head of the yeshiva and the head of the exiled community. But the theory is, this was that year. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs has a whole article. That year that they were in the middle of this deep fissure and division in the community, that was why Rabbi Gamliel wasn't invited to the Seder, and why these other sages are in Bnei Brak, and they're basically making a point that even though we disagree about some stuff, we can disagree agreeably, and that's why they're together. Whereas Rabbi Gamliel, who can't get along with anybody, he's stuck with a bunch of anonymous Zakanim in Lod. Okay, it's a theory. Others suggest, Rabbi Benny Lau has this, that Rabbi Akiva's gathering was connected with the Bar Kokhba revolt, and that it's part of Rabbi Akiva's focus on messianism and on redemption, and that's why they're in Bnei Brak, and he has a whole metaphorical reading of the students coming in the morning. They're saying there's hope after the darkness of the Churban. There is a next day. Also a lovely reading. But, I'm not sure if it's particularly compelling. What I'd like to try to do is to understand the story not based on other historical factors and other tales which appear in the Gemara, but based on the positions of the rabbis themselves, which seems to be the focus of what's being argued on here. And that is the following very important point. Rabbi Gamliel, over and over again, in Pesachim and in other places, chooses to celebrate Pesach in as close a manner as possible as when there was an actual temple. Okay? Rabbi Gamliel instructs his servant, Tavi, to go and roast for us the Pesach sacrifice on a gridiron, right? Something we would never do. Nowadays, some people even avoid roasting any meat at the Seder. Does anybody have that custom? They don't have any roasted meat at the Seder, right?
I've heard of it.
Right? So we, in my parents' house growing up, we had to always have like a potted dish. It was always something that was cooked as opposed to something that was baked or roasted because we were trying to avoid that. And not everyone has that particular custom. But originally, at least Rabbi Gamliel, he roasted, and this is something you're not allowed to do this, he roasted a whole lamb and acted as if it was the Korban Pesach, right? And if you think about it, that's one way to cope with the Churban of the Beit HaMikdash, is to continue on as much as possible, replicating, having a facsimile of the way it was done beforehand. And so that's the significance of the fact that Rabbi Gamliel is focusing on Hilchot Pesach. We use Pesach as this catch-all term for the holiday. When the Tosefta uses Hilchot Pesach, that means the laws of the Paschal sacrifice. What does Rabbi Gamliel do in his post-Churban Seder? He eats a lamb, roasted lamb, and he talks about the laws of the Korban Pesach. Because Rabbi Gamliel is deliberately trying to recapture or retain the flavor, literally, and the focus of the Seder pre-Churban. We don't often think about this, but before the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, what was their Seder really like? Their Seder didn't have a ton of Magid. What their Seder had was the Korban Pesach eaten with some matzah, and they recited Hallel. There may have been a little bit of telling of the story, but the centerpiece of the Seder was this incredible sacrifice, which was the recreation of what the Jews did when they were in Egypt. That's what they did. They offered a korban, right? They didn't tell the story of the Exodus. The first Pesach didn't have Magid because they hadn't gotten out yet. So what was the first Seder? The first Seder was before they were even out. The first Seder was partaking of Korban Pesach, singing God's praises, and getting ready to go. And I think, and this, scholars back up as well, that is what the focus of the Seder was, so long as there was a Korban Pesach, so long as there was a Beit HaMikdash. And that's what Rabbi Gamliel seems to be saying should remain the focus. We need to continue to focus on the Korban Pesach. We need to continue to talk about the laws of the Korban Pesach. That's what this night is about. But the Haggadah reflects a different approach more generally to how to survive and thrive without a temple, more generally, and more specifically, how to carry on with a Seder now that there's not going to be the Korban Pesach. And what becomes the centerpiece of our Seder? Story. Telling the story. Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, which probably had always been an element, but not the focus. Now that becomes the focus. That becomes the main thing. The Tosefta, which is that earlier Rabbi Gamliel version, it doesn't have the Manishtana. It doesn't have all of the stuff that we have as part of our Seder ritual. It's pretty much cut and dry. The halacha, the laws of the Korban Pesach, eating the Korban Pesach, reciting Hallel. That's it. It doesn't even have 4 cups, right? Right. 4 cups is one of the devices we use to tell the story. The first cup is Kiddush, the second cup is Haggadah, the third cup is benching, the fourth cup is the future, the Hallel that we anticipate in the future. So there's a really important message that this story is telling us at the outset of the Seder. How are we supposed to properly commemorate and observe this night? What is this night all about? And what the author of the Haggadah did was, after beginning to tell the story, and maybe even telling the story the way it had always been told, and that was it, now the Haggadah says, and I'm going to tell you a story about these 5 Chachamim who didn't need to tell the story in order to presumably know some of the details, but nevertheless told the story, became engrossed in the story, so engrossed in the story that their students come and tell them about it. This is what the goal of the night is. The goal of the night is, and is to get lost in time, to travel back in time to the Exodus, to think about what it would be like to see ourselves as if we were coming out of Egypt. And that's exactly the model that the Seder gives us by telling us this story. These 5 sages who sat around and didn't really live in the same generation, but okay, we'll overlook that. Rabbi Akiva is significantly younger than the other 4, except for Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah.
So presumably most of them would not have been alive at the time of that.
So they may have overlapped, but like Rabbi Akiva, also remember, became a Baal Tshuva much later on in his life. So he didn't necessarily thrive at the time that they were alive and thriving. So what the Seder, I think, is what the Haggadah is telling us is, here's the guide, here's the paradigmatic story about what we're supposed to try to do. We're supposed to try to become so engrossed in the telling of the story that, like these sages in Bnei Brak, we lose track of time. We become so engrossed in the story that we no longer really even have our senses and our wits about us. And it's really, if you think about it, a beautiful way to kind of begin the ritual of the night. And sometimes we just like read through it and we don't get lost in the telling of the story. And what these rabbis did, I don't think they had as fixed the text as we have, or even in the imagining of the story, they didn't have the fixed text that we had. But what they did have was their ability to tell the story and become engrossed in the story. Yeah. Please.
So then, if that's the case, why not just bring in all the psukim, let's say from Shmuel?
Okay.
Reading the
So
story of.
So which psukim get picked is something I want to talk about next week, because we're going to talk about Arami Oved Avi. I think though the Arami Oved Avi psukim, because of their terseness, and because of the fact that they're the generation afterwards, right? It's in Dvarim. It's actually a better tool for facilitating our own embellishments and adding to the story. I think that's precisely the point. If it was the historical account, it almost would be constricting. And we read it's like a shame, we read the Arami Oved Avi Psukim and just read through them, and that's not what we're supposed to do. We're going to talk next week. I'm going to give you a strategy of how to read those Psukim in a way which allows you to open up additional possible interpretations and readings and understandings. But I think that's, like, in a nutshell, the answer. It's almost better to have kind of these terse psukim, which are then interpreted and which are supposed to facilitate additional interpretation. The problem is the beginning part of the Seder is so interesting and so fascinating that by the time we get to Arami Oved Avi, it's like, okay, let's quickly get to Dayenu so we can, it's 10:30 and we got to eat. And I understand that, but we miss some.
For the purposes that the kids also are like.
Correct, and
I
like.
want to get to Dayenu.
Correct. There's a lot there. I call it the songless, sunsless part of the Seder. Like It's just a lot of text. I don't use the Maxwell House. I use the other one, the yellow and red one, the Goldberg. And it's like 6 long pages with tiny words, as opposed to all the other stuff which has big words, big letters, and yeah. But it's a good question. But I hope next week, that's the trajectory. The next week is to kind of do one demonstration on how, if we read those few psukim, it's only 4 psukim. If we read those 4 psukim and the drashot really carefully, we'll see that there's a lot to unpack there and to discuss and to generate further discussion. Okay. So Rabbi Gamliel represents one approach. And ultimately, his approach to celebrating, commemorating Pesach in the Churban era, ultimately his approach seems to be rejected. And I think this story is told to kind of cement that rejection, right? It's almost too convenient that we have 5 sages, not Rabbi Gamliel, that are Mesubin and Bnei Brak, not Lod, and they're Misaprin as opposed to Oskin Mehilchot Pesach. It really is an inversion of the whole story of Rabbi Gamliel, because the whole point is, the way Rabbi Gamliel did the Seder, that's one way. That's not the way we're doing it. The normative way to do the Seder, the ideal goal of the Seder is not to review Hilchos Korban Pesach the whole night. It's not to talk about, Etzem Lo Tishperu Bo, and the fact that Shalom Nuyav and Shalom Ochlav was a psul only in Korban Pesach and none of the other korbanos. It's fascinating stuff. You have a Masechet Pesachim of the Korban Pesach, and personally, I probably would have really liked Rabbi Gamliel's Seder a whole lot, but that's not what we're supposed to do. And it's even the knowledgeable people. Afilu kulanu chacham, kulanu nevonim. This is not a night for Talmud Torah in its classical sense of Torah study and rigorous analysis. This is a night to get lost in the story. Okay. Now what I want to try to do with the rest of the time is, this is much more speculative what I'm about to do now, but I think this is really interesting. Let's go back to some of those details. Like, if what I'm saying is correct, and like this is a story which is artfully crafted in order to send a really important message about what the Seder night is supposed to be about, can we look back and reconstruct some of those details? Why those 5 rabbis? Why Bnei Brak? And why the students come in? What are the messages here? And where was this just? Are these random 5 sages or not? So, of course, my answer is not. Right? There's nothing random about this story, and I think there's something really. Last year, when I spent a lot of time kind of thinking through this, it all of a sudden became clear to me what the significance of those details is all about. So let's take a look on page 5, Roman numeral 4, from sacrifice to story, the origins of the Haggadah's Maaseh. Why these 5 sages? Why were they in Bnei Brak? And what exactly were they discussing all night? To explain some of these details of the story, we need to look at a debate that is central to the Seder night experience. Okay? The Mishnah in Brachot, the first Mishnah in Brachot, first Mishnah in all of Shas, tells us that there are certain mitzvot which can be done all night, until Amud HaShachar, until dawn. And then there's certain mitzvot that can only be done until midnight. And there's a debate. There are 2 different versions, one in the Mishnah and one in the Tosefta, about the Korban Pesach. Until when can you eat the Korban Pesach? Right? This is a really important debate. What does this debate hinge on? So let's see. The Gemara here spells it out. The burning of the fat. I'm going to read it in English for now. The Mishnah does not mention the eating of the Passover offering. This would point to a contradiction with the following Braita. The duty of the recital of Shema in the evening, and of Hallel on the night of the Passover, and of the eating of the Passover sacrifice can be performed until the break of dawn. So which one is it? Until when can you eat Korban Pesach? Till dawn or just till midnight? Rabbi Yosef says, there is no contradiction. One statement, the Mishnah, conforms with the view of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and the other with the view of Rabbi Akiva. For it has been taught. This is a pasuk that appears in the story in Shemot. And they shall eat of the flesh in that night, referring to the Korban Pesach. V'ichlu et habasar b'layla hazeh. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, here it states, in that night, b'layla hazeh, and further on it is said, for I will go through the land of Egypt in that night, b'layla hazeh, referring to the plague of the firstborn. Ye shall eat, just as the latter verse means until midnight, so also here it means until midnight. When did Makat Bechorot happen? At midnight. So when can you eat the Korban Pesach? Until midnight. Rabbi Akiva said to him, no. But it is also said, you shall eat in haste, b'chipazon, which means until the time of haste, until the time that they rushed out of Egypt. When did they rush out of Egypt? At dawn. They didn't leave in the middle of the night. So according to Rabbi Akiva, the time that you can eat the Korban Pesach till is the whole night, until dawn. Said Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah to him, if that is so, why does it say in the night? Rabbi Akiva answered, because I might think that it may be eaten in the daytime like the sacrifices. Therefore it says in the night, indicating that only in the night it is eaten and not in the day. What does this have to do with anything? Okay? So here's what's so fascinating about this debate. Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah are having a debate about Hilchot Korban Pesach, which is contingent on the story of the night of Egypt. Right? Remember, Rabbi Gamliel at his Seder is talking about the laws of Korban Pesach. And we're told that these 5 sages were discussing the details of the story. And here we have a Gemara which says that 2, and in a moment we're going to see 4 of those 5 sages had a discussion where the halacha wasn't independent. The halacha was contingent on the story. What's the focus of this debate? What's the most important moment during the night of the Exodus? Was it the moment of Makat Bechorot and they had to finish eating their Seder by then? Or was it when they had to get out in the morning? Right? So they're debating the details of the story of the Exodus, which then leads to a debate about some of the laws of Korban Pesach. But then the Gemara gets even more fascinating. The Gemara says, and this debate of these 2 Tanaim is the same controversy of the other Tanaim in the following Braita. There thou shalt sacrifice the Passover offering at even at the going down of the sun, at the season that thou comest forth out of Egypt. Rebbe Eliezer says, at even you sacrifice, at sunset you eat, and at the season that you camest out of Egypt, you must burn the remainder. Rabbi Yeshua says, at even you sacrifice, at sunset you eat, and how long do you continue to eat? Till the season that thou camest out of Egypt. The Gemara then goes on and on about this debate. Here's what we have here. The 4 rabbis, and I underline them in the Hebrew and in the English. Who are the 4 sages who debate the details of the story of the Exodus? Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Yoshua, and Rabbi Eliezer. 4 out of the 5 sages who, lo and behold, are at the Seder in Bnei Brak. Okay, who's missing? Rabbi Tarfon. Where did Rabbi Tarfon? Why did we put Rabbi Tarfon? And they're not just debating random stuff. They're debating how to understand the story and the details of the night and how that relates to the practice on the night of the Seder. So if you look down at the bottom of the page, we'll see where Rabbi Tarfon enters. And I think this also explains why Rabbi Akiva is considered the host. Right? Rabbi Akiva appears in the debate above, and he's also in the debate in the Mishnah in Pesachim with Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Tarfon used to finish the bracha at the end of Magid. You know, right before we make the second cup of wine, we say a long bracha, right? Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher ga'alanu. Right? And then it's a long, long bracha, and then we say Amen, and then we drink Borei Pri Hagafen, and then we say Borei Pri Hagafen. So Rabbi Tarfon's version of that bracha was Asher Ga'alanu v'Galat Avotenu Mitzrayim v'Higiyanu l'Layla Hazeh le'Echol Bo Matzah u'Maror Ve'Eino Chotem. Rabbi Tarfon's practice was to talk about the redemption of the past. who has redeemed us and our ancestors from Egypt and brought us to this night to eat matzah and maror without any further concluding blessing. Rabbi Akiva added, Kein Hashem Elokeinu ve'Elokei Avotenu yagienu l'regalim u'lemoadim acherim habayim likratenu b'shalom smeichim b'vinyan irecha v'sasim b'avodotecha le'echol min hazvachim u'min hapsachim sheyagia damam al kir mizbachecha l'ratzon v'nodeh lecha l'shimcha shir chadash al gulatenu v'al pedut nafshenu baruch atah Hashem Gaal Yisrael. Right? That's, we actually practice like this. We incorporate. What's Rabbi Akiva saying? We don't just talk about the past at the Seder. Part of the story of the Seder is taking the past, referencing the present, but also anticipating the future. So now, if you're the author of the Haggadah, and you're trying to come up with a beautiful story that can tersely serve as the linchpin for the obligation to engross ourselves in the telling of the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, you're going to pick 5 sages. You're not going to pick Rabbi Gamliel because we know he had this other version. But we're going to pick the 5 sages who we have debating the details of the story. Right? It's working backwards from the text that we do have available to us. Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and Rabbi Eliezer all debate this central question of what was the key moment of the Exodus. Was it when Makkah Bechorot hit, or was it when they left in the morning? And they debate and they discuss these details and the implications lahalacha for when we're allowed to eat the Korban Pesach until. So when you're trying to anticipate or construct the importance of the details of the Exodus and telling that story, you're going to choose these guys. And Rabbi Tarfon will throw them in there too, because Rabbi Tarfon said when you conclude the Seder, you should make sure to make the blessing the following way. And Rabbi Akiva added this whole other thing. And why is Rabbi Akiva the host when he's the youngest? Because Rabbi Akiva, I think, this is speculation, he's the one who's involved in both debates. He's the one who seems to be conversing with Rabbi Tarfon, and he's the one who's also conversing with the others about the other issue. Again, I will grant that this is all a bit speculative, but to me, when you realize that there's a purposeful agenda to this particular story, you then look back at the debates and the discussions involving these sages and the Seder night laws and the Seder night story, and it's infused with meaning and significance. Now let's conclude with the last piece. What's our last remaining piece to kind of figure out how did right? And if I were to ask you, what were they debating all night? This is what they were debating. They were discussing, well, I think the most important moment was the Makkah Bechorot. No, Makkah Bechorot was the most important thing. It was when the Bnei Yisrael left in haste in the morning. That's the key moment to focus on. And what when we're telling the story, should we just be focusing on the past redemption, or should we be talking about what the future redemption is going to look like? This dialogue that we have already in rabbinic literature emerges as the focus of the Seder that the Haggadah imagines. Okay. Here, this last part is even more speculative. Okay. What's the whole thing with the students coming in? What's going on there? Like what is that? What's the deeper message there? So I already said that I think part of the message is it's trying to tell us to become so engrossed in the details of the Seder that we lose all track of time. But I think there's another cute literary piece to it. And that is that this story, this strange conclusion to the story, actually parallels another story that we find in rabbinic literature. Okay, not the orderly rooster crowing and the rabbi saying, okay, Seder's over, now it's time to move to the base medrash, but another story that actually involves Rabbi Gamliel and his sons, and which I think is in the back of the mind of our storyteller in the Haggadah. Right? This also is about the first Mishnah in Brachot. The Gemara we saw a moment ago is on that first Mishnah. This is a fascinating story. It's the very first Mishnah in all of Shas, and I've always loved this story because it's playful and it's suggestive and it's fascinating. Meimatai korin et Shema ba'arvin. When can you read the Shema? When do we recite the Shema in the evening? Mishasha Kohanim Nichnasim Le'achol B'Truma Tana Tzov Hashmur Rishona Divrei Rabbi Eliezer V'Chama Omra Chatzot. Right? They have three different opinions. One opinion says the first watch, meaning to like 10 o'clock. The Chama Omra Ad Chatzot. The Chum say until midnight. Rabbi Gamliel Omer Ad Sheyale Amud HaShachar. Rabbi Gamliel says until dawn. Right? So it's already like, right? This is about Shema at night, and the Seder story is about Shema in the morning, and the Seder doesn't involve Rabbi Gamliel, it has the Chachamim, so what's going on? So check this out. Maaseh, right? And it's really interesting. We think of the Mishnah as a repository of law, but there are lots of stories in the Mishnah. And the Mishnah, and the stories in the Mishnah enrich our understanding of the law. Sometimes they subvert our understanding of the law, sometimes they confirm our understanding of the legal rulings. Here, this story, I think, is really interesting. Maaseh ubo banav mi beit hamishte. There's a story that Rabbi Gamliel's sons returned late from a feast. And I love this as a parent, and as a child. I've been through this experience on both sides of the coin, right? Where you come back into your house late at night, first my experience as a teenager, you come back in and you see your dad waiting up for you as you walk in, right? And then now on the other side of it, as the dad, seeing your son, I just made a late Chickies run, Dad. You know, that conversation. So what happens? They come in at 2 o'clock in the morning from some feast. And of course, the Mefarshim say it was a wedding feast, and you know, they were being Mesameach, Chassan, and Kala, but, you know, I don't know. Doesn't say that. Okay? Maaseh bo banav mi beit hamishte. Amru lo, right? They see their father. I love this. They see their father, and they say, oh my gosh, lo karinu es shema. Right? You know, oh Dad, we didn't remember to say Shema. Amar lahem, he said to them, Imlo ala amud hashachar chayavim atem likrot. If dawn has not yet broken, it is your duty to recite it, meaning you still have time. Okay? So I think it's a really interesting story in the sense of like the human dimension, but also the children are cast as kind of the losing track of time, and Rabbi Gamliel is cast as the character who's like, don't worry, there's still time, it's not yet dawn. Halacha says you can go ahead and say it. And if you think about it, the story in the Seder is like an inversion of this. It's the rabbis who lose track of time. It's the rabbis who forget about the time and the halacha. They're not even osek in halacha. Their Seder is like the Beit Mishteh of the children in this Mishnah. They're the ones who are so engrossed and lose track of time that the students come to them and say, "Nu, Rabbi, it's time for Kriyas Shema. You've lost yourself." Right? So I think what this story is doing is purposely kind of reworking and inverting this whole story. And what it's telling us, and I feel it's even more powerful when you think about it, is that the Seder night is a night to lose yourself, to become totally engrossed in telling the story. And look, these rabbis who were the halachic decisors of their generation, on the night of the Seder, they were like Rabbi Gamliel's sons in the Beit Mishteh, maybe not celebrating in a fashion which was questionable, but telling the story, reliving the experience in a way that was so engrossing that they all lost complete track of time and needed the students to jar them back into halachic reality. There's like a total flip here of this role of the parent/teacher and the children/students. And so at the Seder night, the adults are the children are supposed to be the children. The adults are supposed to teach the kids how to tell this story in such a way that we lose ourselves in that story, that we become so engrossed that we lose all track of time, and that the whole night of Yetziat Mitzrayim is a night where we're supposed to go back in time as if we're leaving Egypt, etc. And I think that's why it's so important, and why we stop the Seder in its tracks to tell this story of these 5 rabbis. The 5 rabbis who spent the entire night, whether it's real or not real, that's besides the point. The point is this is the goal. This is the mandate of this evening. It's not to make sure we say every word of the Haggadah. It's to make sure that even as we celebrate Yetziat Mitzrayim, we lose ourselves a bit in that story. Tell the story in such a way that we become so engrossed that, like the sages of Bnei Brak, we almost need the children to remind us of our responsibilities.
To help us lose it, we have 4 glasses.
Yeah, that helps. That definitely helps. That it's not a coincidence that the 4 cups come in with the storytelling. I think that's humorous, but may also be a part of it. And there's the discussion of maybe it has to be wine and it can't be grape juice, because there's supposed to be this slightly intoxicating element to it, and I think that's part of the night. It's really supposed to be an intoxicating evening,
Make you tired.
where we hopefully stay awake but lose ourselves in retelling this story.
What's the purpose of the
Oh,
playing pool?
so I just
And you have Lincoln. at
yeah
the
no.
pool.
So what I think is cool about this is in American art. These are famous pictures where they put presidents. One is all the Republicans and the other is all the Democrats, where they put the presidents together a pool. It's like a famous. This is a famous piece of art, and I think the inspiration for that is the sages in Bnei Brak, where they put the Rambam and Rashi and all the other people together. I'm sorry it didn't come in. That's the most updated one. That's got Obama. It's got Clinton, heavy Clinton. He doesn't look like that anymore. Clinton is standing behind
Here's Clinton.
Truman and Roosevelt, it looks like. And
Truman is next to
Roosevelt
Yeah,
is near Obama.
yeah. yeah.
It's true.
Where is
You can't see
Truman?
Lyndon Johnson is on the left, then Obama, then
Roosevelt.
Roosevelt, then
Roosevelt.
Truman, then Clinton. I don't know who's down there. Jimmy Carter. Oof.
That's
Yeah.
Jimmy Carter. He looks so young.
Yeah.
And George Washington is speaking to them.
Yeah, there's George
George
Washington
Washington's
hanging on the
hanging
wall.
on
George Washington hanging on the wall, but that's not George Washington standing. I don't know who that's supposed to be.
There's
Jefferson.
Kennedy on the
Oh,
right.
that's Jefferson.
I
Yeah,
don't
Kennedy is on his right, and I'm not sure whose face is in between Kennedy and Jefferson.
So who's with
Can't-
Lincoln?
Lincoln, you got the Bushes, and you got Reagan, and you got Eisenhower sitting,
Eisenhower, right.
and Gerald Ford looking at Eisenhower, and
Sitting.
Yeah.
Teddy Roosevelt,
Teddy
I think, in the glasses. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, there you
That's a
go.
good
See,
picture.
little
Very
little
good.
Oh, they show
poli-sci along the way. So next week you should come back, because we're going to try to go through one part of the Seder where we can lose ourselves in the story and show kind of where the terseness of the psukim allows us to kind of get lost in it. Have a good